Are they bringing up, is the only point of bringing up Christianity, the crucifixion, Jesus, Moses, everybody, that plays a role in the Bible, is it to discredit Christianity in the Quran?
I I mean, I think the answer to that would be yes and no. There's a clear line of succession within the Quran. And I think part of this is the confusion on the author of the Quran's part, that they thought they knew what the Torah and the Gospel were. So the Torah and the Injil, the Torah and the Gospel, are referred to multiple times within the Quran itself. And you have a kind of you have succession language, that the Torah was given to Moses and it was full of guidance and light. And the Gospel was given to Jesus and it was full of guidance and light. And then the final revelation is the Quran. But there's almost a tacit implication that they're all saying basically the same thing, and that God's message is unified across all of them. The problem with that is that we know what the Torah and the Gospel looked like in the 7th century in Muhammad's day. It doesn't look any different than what we have now. But I don't think that I don't see any evidence that the author of the Quran knew what the Torah or the Gospel were. So you have 900 approximately either direct quotations or allusions of the Old Testament in the New Testament. In the Quran, you only have one in quotation of either the Old or the New Testament, the lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So in terms of the synchronicity of the Quran to these previous books, it's lacking, to say the least. It's not an organic cultural document like the New Testament is. The New Testament was predominantly written by Jews for Jews and is saturated in Hebraic and Jewish and Old Testament understandings. If you don't understand something about what's going on in the New Testament, going back and reading the Old Testament might actually help you, because there's just so much symbolism and calling back to, and the gospel authors, Jesus is paralleled with Moses and David, and, there are all these things. But the author of the Quran, I think, is aware of some of these Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian fables, is assuming that those are what's going on, and so he's baking those into the text, maybe with the implication to kind of woo the Christians and the Jews to come over to his side. But you see, so I think it's, there's one passage in the Quran that says, it has this kind of succession narrative, right? It talks about the gospel, or the Torah being full of guidance and light and being given to Moses, and then the gospel being full of guidance and light given to Jesus. And then it says, let the people of the gospel judge by what they have therein. Talking to Christians, right? Those are the people of the gospel, the al-Injil. But if they do not judge by what they have therein, they are the defiantly disobedient. Now, in the grammatical context, what they have therein for the people of the gospel is the gospel. So when I'm talking to my Muslim friends, sometimes I open to this passage and I say, like, hey, I don't want to be one of the defiantly disobedient. I want to stand before God and not have that on my shoulders. However, in order to be obedient to this passage, and I judge using the gospel, which it's telling me to do, and I judge the Quran by the gospel, I find the Quran doesn't understand the gospel, has no earthly understanding of what I believe, and actually denies central points of it: the divinity of Christ, the crucifixion. And so if the Quran is true, and it's telling me to do this, then I have to conclude that the Quran is false, because it's telling me to do something that's an impossibility. I cannot judge the Quran by the gospel and find that the Quran actually understands what the gospel is saying. And so this kind of, my Muslim friends often have large articulations. What you have in the gospel isn't what they had in the gospel. I think that's highly problematic. I don't see any reason why in the 7th century, a gospel would be any different than it is to what it is now, especially when, in my own study, in manuscript studies, I can find copies of the gospel in Syriac from Syria in the 6th and 7th centuries. It reads exactly like what my gospel reads today. So it's not that there's no evidence for that. Or if that is the case, And the Quran says that nobody can change God's words. And the gospel is God's word. Who changed it? Who was able to kind of thwart the God of Islam's ability to preserve his word in that endeavor? He was either unable to do it, or he didn't do that. And when he says no one can change my words in the Quran, it's not true. And so ultimately, I think Muslims have a problem. They're painted into these corners. They have these passages about the Torah and the gospel, and yet the Quran doesn't seem to understand what those are, or just flat out contradict it. The Quran denies the crucifixion when we know that the crucifixion happened. And so they're kind of painted themselves into these corners in defending these particular positions. And I don't think that they can stand up to scrutiny.
وتندعون ديه أنا أرض كشت